Johnny Carson was going through his old Norfolk High School yearbook when he found a photo that made his hands tremble. There she was, Margaret Ann Sullivan, the head cheerleader who had rejected him in front of the entire school in 1943. What he discovered about her life now would completely change how he understood rejection, comedy, and the price of fame. This isn't just a story about television or teenage heartbreak. It's about how the people who break our hearts sometimes end up teaching us the most important lessons about what we're really searching for, and why some wounds never fully heal even when we become successful beyond our wildest dreams. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in 1987 at Johnny's Malibu home when he decided to sort through boxes of memorabilia from his childhood in Norfolk, Nebraska. He was preparing for his 25th anniversary on The Tonight Show and had been feeling nostalgic about his journey from small-town magician to America's favorite late-night host. In a dusty cardboard box labeled Johnny's School Things, he found his 1943 Norfolk High School yearbook. As he flipped through the pages, seeing classmates he'd barely thought about in decades, he stopped at page 47. There she was, in the cheerleading squad photo. Margaret Ann Sullivan, captain of the squad, homecoming queen, and the girl who had shattered his 17-year-old heart with a rejection so public and cruel that it had shaped his entire approach to relationships for the rest of his life. Even in the faded black and white yearbook photo, Margaret's beauty was stunning. Auburn hair in perfect victory rolls, bright smile, confident posture that spoke of a girl who had never known doubt or insecurity. Johnny's finger traced her face in the photo. At 61, he was one of the most famous men in America, but looking at Margaret's picture transported him back to being that awkward teenager who did magic tricks and dreamed of making people laugh. Margaret Ann Sullivan, he whispered to himself, remembering how her name used to make his teenage heart race and his palms sweat. But what happened when he decided to find out what became of her would shock him to his core. October 23rd, 1943. 17-year-old Johnny Carson had been building up courage for weeks to ask Margaret Ann Sullivan to the Halloween dance. She was everything he wasn't: popular, confident, from one of Norfolk's most prominent families. Her father owned the largest department store in town, and she seemed to glide through high school like royalty. But Johnny had convinced himself that maybe his growing reputation as the school's resident entertainer might impress her. He'd been performing magic shows at local events and had even started doing some comedy routines. People laughed at his jokes, and he thought surely that counted for something with the most popular girl in school. That Friday after school, Johnny made his move. Margaret was at her locker, surrounded by her usual entourage of popular kids. Johnny walked up, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone could hear it. "Margaret," he said, his voice cracking with nerves, "could I talk to you for a minute?" She turned, surprised. The hallway seemed to go quiet around them. "What about Johnny?" "Well, the Halloween dance is next Saturday, and I was wondering if you'd like to go with me." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Margaret's friends exchanged glances, barely suppressing giggles. Her boyfriend, star quarterback Tom Bradley, looked amused. Margaret's face went bright red, not from embarrassment for herself, but clearly for Johnny. "Johnny, that's really sweet," she said carefully. "But I'm already going with Tom." Johnny nodded, trying to hide his crushing disappointment. "Right, of course. I should have known." But then Margaret's friend Susan spoke up with words that would echo in Johnny's mind for decades. "Margaret, why would you even consider going with him? He's just the weird magic kid who thinks he's funny but isn't really." He'll never be anything but a small-town joke." The group erupted in laughter. Margaret didn't laugh, but she didn't defend Johnny either. Johnny walked away feeling smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. But what he didn't know was that this rejection would fuel a comedic fire that would eventually make him the most beloved entertainer on television. What he also didn't know was the real reason behind Margaret's rejection and how that truth would change everything. 44 years later, sitting in his Malibu study with that old yearbook, Johnny called his assistant Peter. "Peter, I need you to find someone for me," he said quietly. "Margaret Ann Sullivan, from Norfolk, Nebraska. She'd be about 61 now." "Of course, Mr. Carson. What's this regarding?" "Just someone I knew a long time ago. Someone I need to understand." It took Peter's contacts less than 48 hours to locate Margaret Ann Sullivan, now Margaret Sullivan Bradley. The report they brought back made Johnny's stomach drop. Margaret had married Tom Bradley right after high school graduation, just like everyone expected. But their seemingly perfect life had crumbled slowly over the decades. Tom had struggled with alcoholism and gambling addiction, eventually losing the family business and their savings. For the past 20 years, Margaret had been working as a seamstress and taking in laundry to support herself and Tom, who had become increasingly dependent on alcohol and unable to hold down steady work. They lived in a tiny apartment above a dry cleaner in Norfolk, the same town where she'd once been royalty. She'd never left Nebraska, never pursued any of the dreams she'd once shared with friends about traveling or going to college. She'd devoted her life to caring for a man who had slowly destroyed everything they'd built together. But what Peter discovered about Margaret's current situation would shock Johnny even more. Margaret had been following Johnny's career obsessively for decades. Her small apartment was filled with Tonight Show recordings, magazine clippings, and newspaper articles about his success. Her neighbors reported that she watched The Tonight Show religiously and would tell anyone who listened that she went to school with Johnny Carson. She'd tried to contact him multiple times over the years, sending letters to NBC, writing to fan magazines, even calling the studio during his early days in New York. None of her attempts had ever reached him. But it was one document in Peter's report that stopped Johnny cold. A diary entry from 1943, found among Margaret's personal belongings when she'd been hospitalized the previous year. "I feel terrible about what happened with Johnny Carson today. I wanted so badly to say yes when he asked me to the dance. He's sweet and funny and different from all the other boys. But Daddy forbade me from having anything to do with that Carson boy. He says Johnny's family is beneath us and that his silly magic shows are embarrassing to watch. Daddy threatened to not pay for my college and to forbid me from cheerleading if I disobeyed him. I had to say no, but it broke my heart. I hope someday Johnny understands it wasn't really about him. It was about my family's expectations and my own cowardice." Johnny stared at the page, tears streaming down his face. She had wanted to say yes. Her rejection had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with her father's snobbery and social pressures. But what Johnny decided to do next would shock everyone who knew him. The next evening, Johnny sat in his home office and dialed the number Peter had provided. The phone rang several times before a tired voice answered. "Hello, Margaret? This is Johnny Carson." There was a long silence, then a sharp intake of breath. "Johnny, is this really you?" "It's really me, Margaret. I found your diary entry from 1943. Margaret started crying immediately. "Oh my God, Johnny. I've been trying to reach you for 40 years. I know. I'm so sorry I never got your messages. I wish I had known what you were going through. Johnny, I need you to know something about that day at school. I know Johnny interrupted gently. I read about your father's ultimatum. You were protecting your future, and your family was protecting their version of what was best for you. I wanted to say yes so badly, Margaret sobbed. But I was 17 and terrified of losing everything. I chose safety over my heart, and it was the biggest mistake of my life. Margaret, you didn't make a mistake. You made the choice you thought you had to make. But more importantly, you protected both of us from something that wasn't meant to be. What do you mean? If you'd said yes that night, I might never have felt the pain that drove me to perfect my comedy. I might never have left Norfolk, never gone to California, never found my calling. But what Johnny told her next would transform both their lives. Margaret, I want to help you and Tom. Johnny, we can't accept charity. It's not charity. It's gratitude. Gratitude for what? For showing me that I wasn't meant for an ordinary life in Norfolk. Your rejection taught me that my real relationship was supposed to be with the audience, not with any one person. Johnny had already made his decision during their conversation. I'm buying you and Tom a house. A proper house where you can live with dignity. And I'm setting up a fund to take care of Tom's medical needs and your future security. Margaret was sobbing so hard she could barely speak. Johnny, why? After how I hurt you? Because you didn't hurt me, Margaret. You redirected me. And because I spent 44 years wondering why the first girl I ever really loved said no to me. Now I understand it wasn't about love at all. It was about fear and circumstances we couldn't control. He paused. And because no one should have to sacrifice their dreams for someone else's addiction. You've done enough. But the conversation that followed would be the most healing of both their lives. Over the next 3 hours, Johnny and Margaret talked about everything. His struggles with multiple marriages and intimacy, her years of sacrifice and disappointment, the paths their lives had taken since that painful day in 1943. I used to imagine what would have happened if Daddy had let me say yes, Margaret admitted. I've wondered the same thing, Johnny replied. But I think I know now. What do you think would have happened? I think we would have had a wonderful high school romance. Maybe we would have gotten married, stayed in Norfolk, had a quiet life. But America would have lost the Tonight Show, and millions of people would have missed out on the laughter. Johnny's voice grew stronger, and you would have missed the chance to become the strong, devoted woman you became. You stood by Tom for 40 years through his worst struggles. That takes a kind of love I never learned how to give. Do you really believe that? I know it, because the pain of losing you taught me to love performing the way I should have learned to love a person. It wasn't always healthy, but it created something that brought joy to millions of people. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Johnny, can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Anything. Every night for 40 years I've watched you on television and thought about that boy who asked me to the dance. Your monologues, your timing, your kindness to guests. I knew you were still that sweet, funny boy from Norfolk who just wanted someone to believe in him. Johnny felt tears rolling down his cheeks. Margaret, that might be the most beautiful thing anyone's ever said to me. But what happened next would create a legacy neither of them expected. 6 months later, Johnny announced the establishment of the Margaret Ann Sullivan Foundation for Arts Education in Small Towns. Margaret, now living comfortably in a beautiful home Johnny had purchased for her, and Tom, became the foundation's first director of community outreach. This foundation exists because a teenage girl was forced to make an impossible choice between love and family loyalty. Johnny explained during his announcement on The Tonight Show. She chose loyalty, and that choice protected both our destinies. Now we're going to make sure young people in small towns don't have to choose between following their dreams and honoring their families. The foundation provided scholarships, equipment, and mentorship for young performers in rural communities across America. But the most unique aspect was the Second Chance program, where successful entertainers who had faced rejection in their hometowns returned to mentor the next generation. Margaret's experience growing up in a small town with big dreams became the program's foundation. Her insights into family pressure and social expectations were invaluable. Johnny Carson was rejected by a cheerleader in 1943. Margaret would tell young performers that rejection didn't destroy him. It drove him to prove himself on a bigger stage. Sometimes the people who say no in our small worlds are preparing us for yes in the larger world. But the most powerful aspect of the foundation was Margaret and Johnny's personal testimony. During foundation events, Johnny and Margaret would appear together via satellite, telling their story of rejection, understanding, and redemption. I rejected Johnny Carson in 1943. Margaret would tell audiences of young performers, "It was the most difficult decision I was ever forced to make, and I carried guilt about it for 40 years. But I realize now that some rejections are actually protections." How so? Students would ask, "If I had said yes, Johnny might have stayed in Norfolk and never pursued entertainment professionally." Sometimes our limitations push others toward their unlimited potential. Johnny would add, "That rejection taught me that love and performance are different kinds of connection. I spent years trying to fill the hole in my heart with applause, but applause was never meant to replace love. It was meant to create it on a massive scale." Their partnership helped thousands of young artists understand that hometown rejection often redirects us toward our true calling. Tom Bradley eventually got sober with the help of the treatment program Johnny funded. Margaret and Tom's marriage was restored, and they spent his final years traveling and enjoying the security Johnny had provided. The Margaret Ann Sullivan Foundation became one of the most effective arts education organizations in rural America. By Johnny's death in 2005, it had helped over 8,000 young performers find their voices and pursue their dreams. Margaret continued running the foundation until her death in 2010. At her funeral, hundreds of performers whose lives she had touched paid tribute to the woman who had taught them that rejection in small places often leads to acceptance in bigger ones. Johnny visited the foundation regularly throughout his retirement, often doing private shows for the scholarship recipients. "The Tonight Show made me famous," he would tell them, "but helping you follow your dreams makes me happy. There's a difference." The foundation's success rate, students who went on to professional careers in entertainment, was 34%, far above industry averages. But the most important lesson wasn't in the statistics, it was in the story Johnny and Margaret told together. Today, the Margaret Ann Sullivan Foundation continues its work, having helped over 15,000 young performers across rural America find their artistic voices. Their story teaches something profound about rejection and destiny. Sometimes the people who say no to us aren't rejecting us, they're protecting purposes we don't yet understand. Sometimes our deepest wounds become the wells from which our greatest gifts flow. Sometimes love means letting someone go so they can become who they're meant to be, and then finding peace in that choice decades later. Margaret Ann Sullivan could have said yes to Johnny Carson in 1943. They might have had a beautiful romance, maybe even married and lived a quiet life in Norfolk. Instead, she said no. That no sent Johnny on a journey that made him America's beloved late-night host, bringing laughter to millions of homes for 30 years. And her no allowed Margaret to develop the patience and loyalty that would eventually inspire thousands of young artists to pursue their dreams despite hometown doubts. Today, when young performers face rejection in their small towns and think their dreams are impossible, mentors tell them about Johnny and Margaret, two teenagers whose broken hearts led them to their true callings decades later. They tell them that sometimes the person who rejects you is actually protecting your destiny. They tell them that sometimes the smallest stages prepare us for the biggest ones, and they tell them that it's never too late for understanding, forgiveness, and finding purpose in old pain. If this story moved you, remember that every rejection might be redirection towards something greater than you can imagine. The cheerleader who rejected Johnny Carson didn't break his heart. She set it free to bring laughter to the world, and then helped him understand that some gifts are worth the pain it takes to find them. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about getting the person, they're about understanding why you weren't supposed to, and using that understanding to help others find their own happy endings.